For more than 2 decades, the world has watched Angelina Jolie's children grow up. But there is one son who has always seemed determined to stay just outside the frame. His name is Pax Jolie. He was born in Vietnam. He was adopted by Angelina Jolie when he was only 3 years old. And he grew up inside one of the most famous families on the planet. Yet unlike many celebrity children, Pax never seemed interested in becoming a celebrity himself. He rarely gives interviews. He doesn't chase attention. And for years, he has appeared far less often in public than his brothers and sisters. But that doesn't mean Pax disappeared. In fact, he may have simply chosen a different place to stand. Behind the camera, behind the artwork, behind the stories. In 2024, Pax worked with his mother on Without Blood, even appearing with Angelina at the film's Toronto premiere. And in January 2026, something unusual happened. Pax made a rare appearance at the Sundance Film Festival. He was photographed alongside filmmakers connected to self-custody. Not as the son of Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie walking a Hollywood red carpet, but as someone connected to the world of filmmaking. That moment raised an intriguing question. What if Pax's story was never really about becoming famous? What if, while the world was busy watching the Jolie Pitt family, Pax was quietly figuring out what he wanted to create? Because his journey is not simply the story of a boy adopted from Vietnam who grew up in Hollywood. It is the story of a young man surrounded by extraordinary fame, who may have chosen something much harder: to build an identity of his own. And to understand how Pax got there, we have to go back to Vietnam, to the little boy who had no idea that his life was about to change forever. Before Pax Jolie became part of Hollywood's most famous family, he was simply a little boy in Vietnam. Pax Thien was born in Ho Chi Minh City in November 2003. When Angelina Jolie first met him, he was 3 years old and living in an orphanage in the city. Jolie had visited the orphanage with Brad Pitt several months earlier, and in March 2007, she returned to Vietnam to complete their adoption. But Pax's arrival into Angelina's family was different from the story many people might imagine. At that time, Vietnamese adoption rules did not allow an unmarried couple to adopt a child together. So Angelina adopted Pax as a single parent. Brad Pitt would formally adopt him the following year. Suddenly, a 3-year-old boy from Vietnam found himself entering a completely different world. There was Angelina. There was Brad. There was Maddox. There was Zahara. And Shiloh was still very young. Within a short time, Pax had gone from life in an orphanage to becoming part of a rapidly growing family, followed by cameras around the world. But Angelina understood that this transition would not necessarily be easy. Pax was entering a new country, a new home, a new language, and a family he had never known before. Angelina later spoke about those early days and described the importance of building trust and a bond with him. And there was something else that would make Pax's story different. His connection to Vietnam never completely disappeared. In 2011, their entire Jolie Pitt family traveled back to Vietnam. It was the family's first trip to the country since Pax's adoption. Think about that moment. Pax was no longer the 3-year-old boy leaving an orphanage. He was now part of a family of 8. And he was returning to the country where his life had begun. For most people, childhood is something they simply grow up and leave behind. For Pax, his childhood was connected to a country that remained part of his identity. And as he grew older, another transformation began. He was no longer simply the youngest adopted son joining a famous family. He was becoming an individual with his own interests, his own personality, and eventually, his own creative world. While the public continued to associate Pax with Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, Pax was quietly moving towards something very different. art, photography, film, and that would eventually take him somewhere few people expected. Because the boy who entered Hollywood as Angelina Jolie's adopted son would begin finding his place behind the camera. Pax did not simply grow up with famous parents. He grew up inside a family that seemed to attract cameras wherever it went. By the time he joined Angelina Jolie's family, there were already 4 children around him. Maddox, Zahara, Shiloh, and soon after, twins Knox and Vivienne. 6 children, 2 internationally famous parents, and a life that was almost impossible to keep completely private. For Pax, childhood was therefore very different from that of an ordinary teenager. Family vacations could become headlines. Airport appearances could become photographs. A simple walk with Angelina could become entertainment news. And as the children grew older, the public began giving each of them a different identity. Maddox was often associated with Cambodia and filmmaking. Zahara became known for her humanitarian interests and later her involvement with a college sorority. Shiloh attracted enormous attention simply because of who her parents were. Knox and Vivienne grew up under the same extraordinary spotlight. In Pax, he seemed to remain somewhere in between. He was there, but he rarely seemed interested in being seen. That distinction would become one of the defining characteristics of his story. Pax accompanied Angelina on international trips. He appeared with the family at premieres. He was photographed with his brothers and sisters. But there was never a strong sense that he was trying to turn his family name into a personal brand. And perhaps that became even more noticeable as he grew older. Because Pax had something else, a creative side. In addition to his interest in photography and visual art, he became involved in filmmaking and worked behind the scenes on some of Angelina Jolie's projects. That meant he wasn't simply watching his mother work. He was beginning to understand the process himself. And that would become especially important after the Jolie-Pitt marriage ended. In 2016, Angelina filed for divorce from Brad Pitt. The family entered a period of enormous public scrutiny. The headlines became relentless. But throughout those years, Pax himself remained remarkably private. He did not become a regular source of interviews. He did not build a public career around the family conflict. And he rarely offered the world his own version of events. That silence is important, because when you're born into a famous family, the easiest way to gain attention is often to talk about the family. Pax largely did the opposite. He kept his own story away from the spotlight. And eventually, that privacy became part of his identity. But behind that quiet public image, Pax was growing into something very different from the little boy people remembered. He was developing an interest in visual storytelling. He was experimenting with photography. He was learning about film production. And importantly, he was beginning to work alongside his mother. By the time he reached his late teens and early 20s, Pax was no longer simply Angelina Jolie's adopted son from Vietnam. He was becoming a young adult with creative ambitions of his own. And this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Because while Maddox was already establishing himself through production, Pax was exploring the world through images, cameras, art, film, visual storytelling, the same Hollywood environment that could have turned him into another celebrity child, was instead becoming his classroom. And perhaps the biggest clue about the person Pax was becoming could be found not on a red carpet, but behind the camera, because the next chapter would reveal something most people never expected from Angelina Jolie's quietest son. He was trying to become the star of the story. He was learning how to tell the story himself. For years, the public knew Pax as Angelina Jolie's son. But somewhere along the way, another identity began to emerge. Pax the artist, not an actor, not a celebrity chasing red carpets, but someone fascinated by images, visual storytelling, and what happens behind the camera. That interest became especially visible during the making of First They Killed My Father. While Angelina Jolie directed the film in Cambodia, Pax helped the production by photographing scenes and behind-the-scenes moments. Angelina herself later acknowledged his photography work, explaining that Pax did a great job documenting the production. That detail is important, because Pax was simply standing beside his famous mother. He was looking at the production through a camera. He was learning to observe, learning composition, learning timing, learning how a story can be captured without the person behind the camera ever becoming the center of attention. And that seems to fit Pax remarkably well. Because unlike acting, photography doesn't require you to become the face of the story. You can remain behind the lens and still shape what the audience sees. That interest continued to develop. Pax became involved in visual arts and digital and mixed media creative work, reportedly using the artistic name M.To. He also helped create visual material for Angelina Jolie's fashion venture, Angelina Jolie. In 2023, Vogue featured work from the project that Pax helped produce, including video and photography. And then his interest in filmmaking became even more obvious. In 2022, when Angelina Jolie directed Without Blood in Italy, Pax was there simply as her son. He worked as part of their assistant director department alongside his older brother Maddox. The job involved helping communicate between the director and other departments on the production. People who worked on the film noticed. Salma Hayek later described Maddox and Pax as hardworking and serious about their responsibilities. That matters, because Hollywood can give celebrity children access. But access isn't the same thing as respect. Respect has to be earned on the set. And according to people who worked with them, Pax and Maddox earned it. Then, in 2023, Pax was photographed working with Angelina again during the production of Maria in Paris. He carried a radio. He carried a camera. He moved around the set. And he helped his mother while she worked. Look at the progression. At first, Pax was taking photographs. Then, he was documenting filmmaking. Then, he was working inside the production crew. And eventually, he was helping coordinate the work itself. That is a very different path from becoming a Hollywood actor. And perhaps that's exactly why it suits him. Pax doesn't appear to be chasing the spotlight. Instead, he seems drawn toward the creative process that happens before the audience ever sees the finished product. And in January 2026, that interest produced another intriguing moment. Pax made a rare appearance at the Sundance Film Festival, where he was photographed around the self-custody project with director Garrett Patt and producer Fernando Ferro. There was no confirmation that Pax was officially involved with the film, so we shouldn't assume that he was. But his appearance at Sundance was revealing for another reason. He had chosen to spend time at one of the most important independent film gatherings in America. Not a Hollywood Awards ceremony. Not a celebrity fashion event. A film festival. And suddenly, the pieces begin to fit together. The boy from Vietnam. The son who grew up surrounded by movie stars. The teenager who photographed his mother's film. The young man who worked behind the scenes. The artist experimenting with visual media. And now, a 22-year-old appearing at Sundance. Maybe Pax isn't trying to become famous. Maybe he's trying to become good at something. And that distinction could ultimately define his entire future. Because when your parents are Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, the easiest thing in the world is to borrow their identity. The harder thing is to build your own. And Pax appears to be doing that quietly. One image, one camera, and one film set at a time. At 22, Pax Jolie is standing at a very different point in his life. He is no longer the little boy the world first saw arriving in America from Vietnam. He is no longer simply one of Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt's 6 children. And increasingly, He is becoming known for something that has nothing to do with his parents' fame. His creative work. That doesn't mean Pax has completely stepped into the public spotlight. Quite the opposite. He still appears to prefer a relatively private life. But in 2026, there have been signs that his connection to filmmaking is becoming more visible. In January, Pax made a rare public appearance at the Sundance Film Festival. He attended a screening of Self-Custody and was photographed talking with director Garrett Patt and producer Fernando Ferro. There is an important detail here. There is no confirmed evidence that Pax was officially working on Self-Custody. So this isn't a story about Pax suddenly becoming part of another Hollywood production. But his presence at Sundance is still interesting. Because Sundance isn't simply another celebrity red carpet. It is a major gathering for independent filmmakers, actors, producers, and people who care about the filmmaking process. And Pax was there, quietly, without a huge announcement, without trying to turn the moment into a publicity campaign. That fits the pattern we've seen throughout his adult life. He appears to be moving toward filmmaking without making filmmaking about himself. And there is now a substantial record of that interest. People reported in February that Pax had worked as a still photographer on First They Killed My Father, and later worked in production on Maria. He also worked with Maddox in their assistant director department on Without Blood, something Angelina Jolie herself described as a natural family collaboration on set. So when we look at Pax today, we aren't looking at someone who simply says he's interested in film. We are looking at someone who has already spent years around actual productions. And that distinction matters, because being born into Hollywood gives you access. It can get you onto a set. It can introduce you to filmmakers. It can open doors that would otherwise be difficult to reach. But it doesn't automatically teach you the craft. Pax still has to learn, still has to work, still has to develop his own eye. And perhaps that's why his story is more interesting than simply asking whether he will become famous. The better question is, what kind of artist does Pax want to become? We don't know yet, and we shouldn't pretend that we do. He could continue with cinematography. He could work in photography. He could move deeper into filmmaking. He could explore music. Or he could eventually choose an entirely different path. Angelina has previously said that Pax loves music and DJing, showing that his interests extend beyond film. At 22, there is still plenty of time for that identity to change. And maybe that's the most important thing about this chapter. Pax doesn't need to have everything figured out yet. He doesn't need to become the next Brad Pitt. He doesn't need to become the next Angelina Jolie. He doesn't even need to become a famous filmmaker. He has something much more valuable: the freedom to decide. For years, the public had already decided who Pax was. Angelina Jolie's son. Brad Pitt's son. The Vietnamese child, adopted into a famous Hollywood family. But now he's old enough to write a different description for himself. One that doesn't begin with his parents. And perhaps that is what Pax has been doing all along. Not running away from his family's legacy, but quietly choosing what parts of it he wants to carry forward. The camera, the art, the stories, the international perspective, and their ability to remain behind the scenes while still having something to say. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't the one with the least to say. They are simply waiting until they have something worth showing. And for Pax Jolie, that moment may only be beginning. For most of his life, Pax Jolie has been introduced through the names of other people. Angelina Jolie's son. Brad Pitt's son. One of 6 children from Hollywood's most famous former couple. But at 22, that description is starting to feel incomplete. Because Pax has already begun creating something that belongs entirely to him. A creative identity. His connection to filmmaking is no longer just a childhood interest. Angelina Jolie has said that Pax tends to work with still photography, and that director Pablo Larraín recognized he was good at it while working on Maria. Pax and Maddox also worked in assistant directing roles on the production. On Without Blood, the progression became even clearer. Pax and Maddox worked behind the scenes as assistant directors, and Salma Hayek later praised their professionalism and said they earned the respect of the crew. That is important, because Hollywood gave Pax something most aspiring filmmakers spend years trying to obtain: access. But access is not the same as talent, and it is not the same as experience. Pax still had to learn. He had to show up. He had to work. He had to understand what happens when the cameras stop rolling and the real work begins. And perhaps that is why his appearance at Sundance in January 2026 was so interesting. Pax was seen at a screening of Self-Custody, talking with director Garrett Pat and producer Fernando Ferro before attending a party connected to the film. There has been no confirmed indication that he officially worked on the movie, so we should not assume that he did. But the location itself tells us something. Sundance, independent filmmaking, directors, producers, people building movies outside the traditional Hollywood system. And there was Pax, not surrounded by paparazzi, not promoting himself, just quietly moving through a world that seems increasingly familiar to him. Maybe that is the real story. Pax doesn't appear to be trying to escape his family's legacy, but he also doesn't appear to be satisfied simply inheriting it. He is taking pieces of that world and turning them into something personal. Photography, art, film, music, visual storytelling. A camera can capture someone else's story, but it can also become a way of telling your own. And that may be what makes Pax different. Maddox has increasingly become associated with production and filmmaking. Knox has developed his own passion outside the entertainment industry. And Pax seems to be finding his identity through visual creativity. 3 siblings, 3 different paths. None of them have to become another Brad Pitt. None of them have to become another Angelina Jolie. And that may be exactly what their mother wanted for them. Because the greatest privilege of growing up with extraordinary parents isn't necessarily inheriting their careers. It is having the freedom to discover what you want to do with your own life. Pax was born in Vietnam. He was adopted at 3. He grew up under a microscope. He watched his family become one of the most photographed families in the world. And yet somehow, he found a way to remain himself. Now he is 22, and his story is still being writ. We don't know whether he will eventually become a director, a photographer, a producer, an artist, or something completely different. And honestly, we don't need to know yet, because perhaps the most interesting thing about Pax Jolie is not where he ends up. It is the fact that he is finally choosing the direction for himself. He was once introduced to the world as a little boy from Vietnam who became Angelina Jolie's son. Today, he is becoming something else. Not simply a celebrity child, not simply Brad Pitt's son, not simply Angelina Jolie's son, but a young man standing behind the camera, trying to decide what story he wants to tell. Some children inherit a famous name. Pax inherited something more complicated: the freedom to decide what that name means. And maybe the most interesting chapter of Pax Jolie's story has not even begun yet.